Well, let's start with a prayer. O Lord Jesus Christ, true God and true man, your spirit once again. Empower us to be truly your sisters and brothers. Help us to live in your image. As you have shared in our humanity, so also allow us to share in your divinity, so that the union between God and humanity that was in Jesus may also be in us. As we prepare for the great season of Lent, give us the courage to lay down our lives. Give us the wisdom of the desert. Bare our hearts. Help us to confront our demons. Open us to that presence in our lives that you have always desired, but that we, in our fears, have pushed away. Purify us. Burn away the dross of selfishness and greed. Remove the barriers that separate us from each other and from you, who live in absolute union with the Father and the Holy Spirit, God, forever and ever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So we just want to take a look at Pope Leo's apostolic exhortation on the poor, Dilexi Te, which is Latin for "I have loved you," and that, of course, comes from the Book of Revelation, and it's a kind of a continuation of Dilexi Nos, which was the last exhortation of Pope Francis. And in this, Leo, of course, in so many ways, he's been saying, there's not going to be any break here. I am the new Francis. I'm continuing all of his major themes, his major concerns, his major innovations into the life of the church, and of course that's been good news to us all. And so, but he expands on what Pope Francis had said, and really adds his own notes to it, and they're profound, I think. And so we're just kind of gonna march through it, but since we have a fairly small group, rather than breaking into groups, let's just open this up all the way through this evening. Anytime you want to raise your hand and make a comment, feel free to do so. I think it'd be good for us to have a discussion about this rather than just hearing it alone. So he addresses this to all Christians. And I find that interesting in itself. Yes, he's the leader of the Catholic Church, but in many ways, he's the leader of the faithful world, and the gospel isn't just for Catholics; it's for all Christians, and really, for many enlightened non-Christians, the gospel is a great message as well, and they read it and they pray with it, and it's a message for all. But he says we have kind of tended to ignore it. There is a tendency within the sinful humanity to do a couple of things. One is to privatize the gospel, and so much of the scriptures are intended for the nation of Israel, not individual people, but all of them, the community, God's family. And but to privatize that, to make that about individuals and individual sin rather than systemic sin or structural sin, that's very convenient for powerful people, but it is anti-gospel. Jesus always stood with the poor, and we have to be real about this. What got Jesus killed was that he was criticizing the current structures, and those structures, those systems, religious and political and economic, they were working for certain people. And when a system is working for you, you really don't want to see it challenged. And so that system was working for the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, the people on the religious top, the hierarchy, you might say. Uh, that system of oppression was working for them. And and so despite the goodness and the good intentions of many of those people, uh, when Jesus began to shake the foundations of their system, uh, maybe without even always knowing why, they just got really defensive and and reacted, and their reaction was violent, wasn't it? I've been struck for years by these gospel passages where uh, Jesus cures somebody on the Sabbath, and for that infraction, they plot to kill him. Doesn't it seem like an overreaction? He broke one of their laws, and they're going to kill him for that. Um, Capital punishment for healing somebody on the Sabbath. I mean, it just makes no logical sense unless you understand that he was shaking the foundations of their system, and uh, and the fact that he did that repeatedly, and he broke other laws like touching coffins of dead people, uh, eating with tax collectors and sinners, uh, touching lepers when he wasn't supposed to. I mean, Jesus seems to be kind of intentional about a lot of that. There are 6 other days of the week. Jesus could have healed those people on those other days just as easily, but he seems to choose the Sabbath because he wants to, you know, um, make a point. And well, in our world today, it's not that different. A lot of us middle class Americans, we're part of the system that works well for us. And so we don't really like to have people challenging that. I mean, this group here tonight probably isn't all that uncomfortable with it, but a lot of people are. And as a priest, I have to be careful what I say from the pulpit because people can just get so irate about these things. And a few times in my life, I have had people after Mass just really get up in my face and yell at me for something I said that made them uncomfortable. Um, and so, my reaction is usually just say, I'm sorry, take it, because you don't want to have a screaming match right there in front of everybody. That wouldn't be productive at all. Uh, so, uh, one of the things that Pope Leo is saying is this privatization, this individualization of the gospel has not worked well for us as a world, as the people of God. Uh, and he's also saying that Jesus never really intended that. So one of the things he says that I find kind of insightful, in many ways, it's not such a great idea, but I still think it's an insight that, at least for me, because I didn't think of this in this specific way. And he says that the poor are a revelation. Uh, they're not just a social stratum. They're not just a category of people in the world, but they are actually where we find God. God is revealed to us in them. Now, revelation comes from a number of different sources. It comes from the scripture, it comes from church teaching. But the teaching of the church is that the ultimate revelation, the one that encompasses it all, is Christ. And in becoming human, he reveals to us who God is, a God for the poor, uh, a God of justice. Uh, in in his various stories, like the story of the prodigal son, which is really more about the father than the two sons. The father who uh, forgives the recalcitrant son, even though the other son can't. The father who runs out to greet him. The father who pleads with the older son to be more merciful. Um, it's so countercultural. A father, a landowner like that man in the story, would never act like that. But Jesus is revealing God. He's saying this is who God is. And and Jesus comes to announce the good news. And the good news is that God isn't holding our sins against us, that God isn't mad. Um, so much of pagan religion and Jewish religion too at the time was presenting a God who is, uh, you know, testy and easily upset. And so we offer sacrifices to keep the gods at bay, uh, to calm their anger so they'll leave our crops alone, you know. Uh, and that's not the God who Jesus reveals. But in revealing God to us, he also reveals us to us. Because if we're made in God's image, then we are people of justice and truth and love, and that we cannot fulfill our human nature in any other way. So for us to act unjustly is, it goes against our humanity. And uh, I think it was St. Augustine who said, um, the revelation of God is humanity fully alive, humanity fulfilling its nature, which is to be like God, uh, to have that union in us, in our bodies, that was in Jesus, the fullness of divinity and the fullness of humanity in one person. Um, that's our destiny too. That's who we are. Uh, and to not move in that direction is anti-gospel. It's sinful. It's it's not it's worse than just failing. Although, when we say the Confiteor, we're saying the things we have done and the things we have failed to do. You know, but I think there's a failure against our human nature, a failure against our humanity, uh, to be turned in on ourselves and to ignore the poor. Okay, so if the poor are a revelation to us, um, we cannot really find God without them. Isn't that um, that seems like a radical thing to say, that we can't find God without the poor. If we are completely disconnected from them, if we are living in our middle class world and they're living on the other side of the tracks, or whatever the dividing line is, redlining, then we're being a bit hypocritical by going to mass and being part of a church community and all those kinds of things, and thinking ourselves righteous. It's Pharisaical. Well, that's a challenge that I think a lot of people really wouldn't want to be uh, confronted with, but that's kind of what Pope Leo is saying. He says the poor are not there by chance or by blind and cruel fate, nor for most of them is poverty a choice. And poverty is a choice for religious communities, for example, take a vow of poverty. But that's a very different thing. There are still those who still presume to make this claim, which kind of reveals their own blindness and their cruelty. It's their lot in life. I'm sorry about that, but I was destined to be well off and comfortable, and they weren't, and so blame God. uh, that Pope Leo calls that cruel. And of course, he acknowledges that there are people who don't work, and there are people who are lazy. I mean, it exists. One of our favorite categorizations about the poor is that they're lazy. And it's true that some of them are. But we're also all aware of those who are working 3 jobs. They're working hard, but they can never get ahead. And the system is stacked against them. I don't know if any of you have ever done one of these workshops. They have these in Manhattan every now and then. And so a group of people meet in like a parish hall or some kind of public place, and they have the whole thing set up, and you are sort of set up with a family or whatever, and you have to go through these various activities, and you have tickets for this, and ways to get a ride to work and things like that. That was such an eye opener for me. My particular family, we ended up on the street, and we were all very intelligent, successful people, and I think most of us thought, well, we're going to beat this system, and we couldn't. We ended up on the street because the cards were just stacked against us, and so many people in our world are living in that hardship, and it's not by choice, and it's not because they're lazy. In chapter 2 of the document, he talks about God choosing the poor, and for God to choose Israel, that was a choice for the poor in itself. Throughout its history, Israel has been a vassal state of other more powerful nations. Rarely in all of its history has it had autonomous rule. And I think it might have been Golda Meir who once said, wasn't it odd that God would choose the only nation in the Mideast without oil? This is a poor nation. And of course, they start out as slaves in Egypt. And so God hears the cry of the oppressed. Now, in modern times, liberation theology kind of coined this phrase, I think, but it's used much more widely than that now, and that is the preferential option for the poor. And it has struck me recently that that is exactly what DEI is. What does DEI stand for? Diversity, inclusion is the I.
Equity.
Equity, thank you.
Equity.
Yeah. And so isn't it interesting that in the political world of America today, that has been turned around to be some kind of evil, that there's something wrong about DEI. Well, hello, it's God's preferential option for the poor. Setting quotas to get more minorities, more poor people into our structures and our systems so that they can be successful too, That's just gospel. How have we turned that around and made that evil? Um, this is God. This is the way God acts. We could make the argument, well, God is DEI because he chose the Jews. You know, they were nobodies, and he gave them all kinds of special favors, uh, and loved them with a preferential option, and Egypt and Babylon and others could rightly say, well, that's DEI, and what kind of a God would do that? Well, our God does that, and we who are his children, that's what we do as well. At the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he quotes Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. That's Jesus' opening line for his public ministry. I have been anointed to bring good news to the poor, release to captives. Okay. In America today, we have a higher percentage of our population incarcerated than any other nation on earth. And one of the things that exacerbates that is we have turned our penal system over to private corporations, and they're making money off of prisoners. And so they have powerful lobbyists that make sure that we keep the prisons full because they're making money off of it. And for every empty cell, they're losing money. I'm sorry, but that's just an evil system. And of course, it's heavily tilted toward the poor and people of color. The rate of prisoners of color is so drastically much higher than those of white people. And if you are rich, there's a high chance, a high probability that you can pay lawyers enough money to find a loophole and get you out of jail, or you'll never go there. But that option isn't there for poor people. You just go immediately to jail and you don't get out. So it's not just good news for the poor, it's release to captives. But then what are captives? Yeah, the incarcerated, obviously. But what about sex trafficking? What about the people who, in horrific numbers, are sold by their parents even for money, or they're kidnapped and they are moved around the world and used for sex and for slave labor, and it's just it cries out to heaven for vengeance, and we tend to look the other way. And one of the reasons we look the other way is because we feel powerless. Uh, we might even offer a prayer or a number of prayers. We might have concern in our hearts, but we just feel powerless to change these unjust systems. And one of the things that Pope Leo is arguing for is that it's more than just generosity to the poor. It's more than mercy. It has to be justice. And so here in North Central Kansas, we are establishing a new justice ministry, and we're kind of affiliated with a national group, and that national group makes a distinction between mercy and justice. And mercy is I forget how Pope Leo points it, how he phrases it, but it's acts of charity. So we have Catholic Charities, Vincent de Paul. There are homeless shelters, food banks. I mean, our culture has a lot of institutional aid uh, to the poor, and the United States even had aid to developing nations, which has recently been cut off, which is another horrific event. But well, and those things are always going to be important, but they're kind of like band-aids. What Pope Leo says is they are temporary. They solve an immediate need, but that same need is going to be back again tomorrow. Okay, justice, by contrast, looks at the causes of this situation. Why are these people in dire straits? Is there something in our system that could be altered without too much trouble and eradicate the problem? So like mercy is like the leaves on a tree, and justice is the roots of the tree. And so, and justice is harder in a lot of ways, because the mercy things, and I don't want to denigrate them, because we're always going to need those, and they're absolutely necessary, and the church needs to be involved in those things. But we can feel kind of good about that, and it doesn't take too much of our time or our money. Justice is harder, because when you shake the foundation of systems like Jesus did, the systems fight back, and they're very powerful. They can access the government. They can shut you up. They can make you look ridiculous. They can make you look evil, because they have power structures behind them. So I had a professor years ago, and he was a liberation theologian. He was originally from Germany, and he studied at Catholic U in Washington, and then he spent a few years in Latin America, but then he spent most of his priesthood in the Philippines, working with base communities, liberation theology, and so he had a lifetime of perspective from preferential option for the poor, and a lifetime of uh, critiquing unjust systems and challenging them. And so one day in class, he said, this was years ago when Mother Teresa was still alive and active. And he said, not to take too much away from Mother Teresa, but she ministers to poor, dying people. And it's admirable. And people give her money. Her sisters, they are able to establish all kinds of charitable works because rich people around the world give them tons of money. And one of the reasons they do that is because she does their dirty work for them, and she makes them feel good because they can write a check. But he said, Mother Teresa has never opened her mouth to challenge an unjust system. She just puts a Band-Aid on it. Well, I tell you that story because that's part of the difference between mercy and justice. And again, the Little Sisters of the Poor, we're always going to need them. And their work is necessary and admirable, but the work of justice is also always going to be needed, to look at the root causes of poverty. And our popes in recent decades and really, I suppose long before that, you go back to Leo the 13th with Rerum Novarum, his encyclical. But the social encyclicals, social teaching of the church is vast, and unfortunately we have ignored it pretty much in recent years. But I remember in the year 2000, which was the millennial year, and Pope John Paul, said some really courageous things for which he got laughed at by the financial community. He suggested that the wealthy nation should forgive the debts of the poorer nations. And the wealthy nations scoffed at him like, well, you're just a pope. What would you know about economics? But he was so right. And actually, some of the wealthier nations did forgive debts, and it actually served both sides. When we are community, both sides win. And once those debts were forgiven with those developing nations, then they had the money to do more things on their own, and then they needed less foreign aid. And so the same countries that were giving them tons of foreign aid were sucking off of them for interest, and it was just cycling money around, and nobody was winning. But when they forgave the debts, both sides won. So Pope John Paul was more brilliant than they realized. And it wasn't human brilliance, it was the gospel. He was just a man of faith, reading the gospel as it should be read. And but you're probably familiar with the Jubilee year that was written into the Torah, the law of Israel, that every 7 years all the debts had to be forgiven. And there's no historical evidence that Israel ever lived that out. But imagine if all the debts had to be forgiven every 7 years, nobody could amass very much wealth. There would be no billionaires on earth. There might not even be any millionaires. And the one percenters who control 90% of the world's wealth, and they're only 10% of the world's people, they do that largely off of interest. Their investments just make them money every day without lifting a finger. It just makes more money. And but if they had to forgive those debts every 7 years, they would never be able to amass that kind of wealth. And there would never be anybody starving. So God's plan for Israel actually was what was a good economic plan if it had ever been carried out. And it would be a good plan for the world in any age, but it's never been carried out. So Leo, he quotes the letter of James. This is in slide 11 if you're following along. The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Wow. He doesn't mince words. And really, Pope Leo doesn't either. He says that's a gospel message that's just so simple and clear that we really can't avoid it. And we can't relativize it. We are a church for the poor, God is a God for the poor. And so therefore, if we are authentic church, we have to be a church for the poor. And then he goes through a number of the early patristic period and the scholastic period, various ages in the church history where at least some members of the church have tried to live that gospel message more radically. And there's a wonderful spirit in much of Christianity that strives for that gospel truth. And so I'm thinking, for example, in the Protestant community, Quakers and Brethren, the Amish, they try to kind of separate themselves from the world to live a more radical gospel life, radical community. And, none of those movements have ever been perfect. But you have to admire the sense of community that they have. In the Catholic tradition, I think it's been more with religious orders, and that's basically what Pope Leo is saying too. There have been religious orders in every generation that have risen to live the gospel values more radically. And in many cases, you have to separate yourself from the world. So the whole Benedictine monastic tradition, that you separate from the world and you live together in community in a monastery, which is on the one hand a very closed system, and yet the Benedictine tradition has always been outgoing. It's always related to the outside world. And so the Benedictine tradition of hospitality, that whoever comes to the door of the monastery in need is Christ. And I love that little story about the monk in a monastery who he's in charge of the door. And so people have been coming all day long asking for handouts, and and he's been giving them food and whatever. And he's pretty exhausted. And so that night the door gets knocked on again. And he said, "Oh, Jesus, is it you again?" and yes, it is. That's the revelation that Leo is talking about. God is in the poor. That's where Christ is. And so that attempt to live radically, something that is in one way closed in, but in another way connected. And in European history, towns built up around these monasteries, and people survived off of the generosity of the monks. And the monks, would sometimes employ people in their farms and stuff like that. And so the irony is kind of rich, that a monastic community leaves the city and goes out to a deserted place and establishes a monastery, which attracts people, and then a town builds up around it. I love that image. And I'm sure it wasn't always comfortable, but just as an image, I think that really works. But some of you sisters here, you're in religious communities, and each of you, Dominicans, Josephites, you have your own charism, from your founder and from your tradition. And when you become a Dominican, when you become a Sister of St. Joseph, when you become a Franciscan or Jesuit, whatever, uh, in novitiate, you study that tradition, and you're taught how to make that charism part of your spiritual identity. And of course, there's individuality within communities, and everybody, no individuality is really lost, but in the community life, something is gained. And but there is a dying there. I learned something recently that, and I don't know why I didn't know this before, but I think it's uh, wonderful. It was pointed out to me that communion, the word communion, has two M's. And I've always explained it, it's com unio, union with. But what's that second M there? Actually, the root word is not unio, it's munus. And munus is a radical dedication. And one of the most, when you look in an exhaustive Latin dictionary, and I've looked at several of them after hearing this, and they all mention the same thing, that one of its specific uses, munus, had to do with gladiators. And gladiators were slaves, and they were owned by a patron. And they gave their lives to that patron. They're in the arena, and many of them lost their lives, and they did it for their patron. It's that dedication unto death, you might say. And so I've been reflecting on that. And, we use the word communion for what we do at Mass. And yes, it's union, but it's union at a cost. In the Trinity, they're all dying. The Father and the Son and the Spirit, each of them is offering their lives without any reservation. It's been said there is no self-concern in the Trinity. There's no self-concern in the Trinity. There's no guardedness. There's no protective attitude. There's no fear. There's only self-offering. And because that self-offering, because that dying to self is so complete in all three of them, they are one God with complete union. Well, that's our destiny too. And of course, that was in Christ. That was in Jesus. And that's what's supposed to be in us. So the essence of participation in the liturgy is self-offering. It's participating in the Paschal mystery. The Paschal mystery, the dying and rising of Christ, is not just something to be admired by us, but something to be emulated by us, something to be lived by us. And of course, we find that hard to do, but ritually, at least in the Mass, even if we can't do it fully in life, ritually, we lay down our lives. We lose our self-concern, and we become absolutely one with Christ and with our sisters and brothers. But we don't get there without dying. I can't be protective. I can't say, don't sit in this pew with me, or I demand the end of the pew, or I don't want to hear any babies crying. There's all kinds of ways, even in the liturgy, that we are not very self-offering. Somebody said one time, and we talk a lot about hospitality in liturgy, and somebody said, hospitality is coming into an empty pew and sitting in the middle so that nobody has to climb over you to get to their seat. that's a generous act. Okay. Um, I think that's very true. Ever since I've heard that, when I'm on vacation and I'm sitting in a pew, I always go right to the center. And of course, what happens is I get trapped, you know, and I have to sit with unknown people on both sides of me, and you know, that's self-offering. Okay, so um, living a life of community in a religious order, for example, I mean, you sisters can tell this story better than I, how much that involves dying to self. And because it can't happen if the community members are not willing to die, then community cannot happen. And one of the failures of community, and you sisters can talk about the failures too, because it's not always, ideal like we like to describe it. It's messy, and there's there are arguments and strife, and uh, all that happens within community. But it happens within families too. You know, siblings yell at each other, hit each other, um, and then they forgive each other. Um, it happens in marriage. In marriage, people learn each other's buttons, and they know when to push them and how hard to push. Uh, they they know the really hurtful things that they should never say, but they say them anyway. Uh, Community is hard, and so it so we're talking about the particulars in community, marriage, family, uh, religious community. But then there's the whole church that is a community. And that has its own challenges. Um, how do I how do I how do I promote community by the way I live and the way I interact with other people? Um, and just a little aside here, one of the problems that we're experiencing in America today is, well, it's always been a problem in America, rampant individualism. And so for several generations now, we've had people saying things like, well, I believe in God, but I don't want to belong to a religion. Or uh, I have faith, but I don't want to go to a church service with other people. Um, how does that even make sense? Um, there's a recent trend, uh, and particularly in the Catholic Church, and I don't always know why, but there's a recent trend of people coming back to liturgy, coming back to church. Um, and I think part of that is COVID, uh, because COVID, it took that worst inclination that many Americans had of I I don't want to I don't want to go to a movie theater and sit there with a bunch of other people. I want to downstream it and watch it in my own living room, you know. And then we did that with Mass. You know, I could watch Mass on TV in my pajamas with a cup of coffee in my hand. Um, Convenience is everything. But then COVID also taught us how empty that is. I found it uh, we were warned by all the pundits that you better be careful because the people aren't going to come back to Mass. And I think that has happened in some places, but that has not been my experience. My experience is that we have more people coming to Mass now than ever before. Uh, we're we're actually talking about adding some more parking. Isn't that crazy? Um, and I think that people, and well, actually, people have said that to me. Yes, it was nice uh, to have Mass at home, but I missed people. I They didn't realize how important the communal dimension was in their lives until they didn't have it. And we're a far cry from resolving all of those issues, but so who are these poor then that we're supposed to find revelation in? Well, obviously, it's the destitute. It's the widow and the orphan. That's the scriptural phrase. And I think you all understand why widows and orphans were always mentioned. In that culture, in that time, there were no jobs for women. So if a woman didn't have a husband or a son who could take care of her, she was destitute. She just had to beg. And and that's the wonderful, the story of the widow of Nain, Jesus coming into that little town called Nain, and his retinue meets another retinue going at the gate of the city, and the other retinue is going out to the cemetery, and they're burying her only son, and she's a widow. So from this point on, she's going to be destitute. She's going to have to beg for every meal. And Jesus takes pity on her and raises her son from the dead. Does a really radical thing for her. Yes, her son is brought back to life, but isn't she brought back to life also? And, so many of these gospel stories about what Jesus does for destitute people, they're so telling in terms of what every generation and every what the church and the world should be emulating. How can we miss those lessons? So the community was so essential, and in a radical way, problematic in Jesus' day and in Israel. There was almost no individuality at all. The community was everything. And so to be excommunicated from the temple meant that your own family was not even allowed to talk to you. And you see that in some Amish communities too, where somebody is estranged and shunned. And so, we just had last week that story of the man born blind, and his parents won't testify on his behalf. They push it off on him. He's of age; he can speak for himself. And they said this because of fear of the Jews, because they had decided that anyone who proclaimed Jesus as worthwhile at all would be kicked out of the synagogue, and to be kicked out of the synagogue was to be kicked out of the community, to be ostracized, to be shunned forever. And they didn't want that, and so they don't defend their own son. They don't take his side out of fear. Well, or you take lepers. They're ostracized from the community. Many of the sicknesses that were in the community in those days were thought to be the cause of sin, or the result of sin, and so therefore those people were unworthy to be part of the community. So when Jesus restores their health, he's restoring them to the community at the same time. And so this communal life, from which some people are deprived by poverty, others are deprived by crime, by sin, and all of this stuff gets kind of muddled. One of the things that we're discovering about the penal system in our cities, particularly our county jails, is that over 50% of the people who are incarcerated did not commit crimes. They have mental illness. And so they were causing disturbance for somebody and they called the police. And what are the police going to do? They're not psychologists. So they put them in jail. I'm not blaming the police there. Um, and for a couple of years, the county jail here in Manhattan, they had some kind of a grant. I need to investigate where that came from. Uh, and so this grant paid for the salary of a full-time psychologist to work at the jail. And the people, and I do some jail ministry there, so I sometimes talk to the jailers, the people who work there. And when that grant ended and didn't get renewed, they had to let that guy go. And they told me how drastic that was. You know, first of all, how much good that person did for prisoners who really needed some mental help, uh, and and then how it all just went back to chaos after the guy left. Well, you know, we're all aware that a lot of the people in jail are addicted to drugs or even to alcohol, you know, and so you get a DUI and you end up in jail. You get caught with drugs, and I'm not talking about selling them necessarily, but if you get caught with possession, you're in jail. Well, who can be more trapped than someone who's addicted? Sister Rosemary, you have your hand up. Turn on your mic, okay?
Father Frank, before you get too far removed from
Sure.
talking about the women and the destitute, just a little history in my family.
Okay.
My grandmother was raised in a family of 7 girls, and they were in Germany. And the dad could not afford to help take care of them because he couldn't get any land because he didn't have a son. So he ended up finding a way to get over here to the United States where he could raise his 7 girls, which was my grandmother was one of those girls. But anyway, that's just a little, and I wish now I could have spoken about that or talked about it or got more history behind it. But that's the piece that I got from my history of women in Germany at that time.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you bring up another thing, sister, and that is the whole issue of immigration. And Pope Francis and Pope Leo have spoken so strongly in favor of immigration, or not so much in favor of it, but defending the right to immigrate out of poverty or out of enslavement or injustice, oppression. But most of us here tonight, our ancestors came from some other country, and they didn't come over here because they thought, oh, I think I'll just go over and experience a new land. You know, they came because they were starving to death, or they were living under such oppression they just couldn't take it anymore, and so this was the place they could go. And then a few generations later, so many of our brothers and sisters have forgotten that, and we don't want people immigrating to this country. You know, what does it say on the Statue of Liberty? Give me your tired, your poor, your masses. I mean, that's gospel, and but you don't hear people quoting that too much. I'm of Irish heritage, and I've watched a couple of these TV shows in recent years where they talk about what it was like for those people to come over um, in to America, and you know the way they were treated and the horrible conditions, and of course what was done to them by the British that would force them to come over here in the first place, and the potato famine and all that. Um, and of course Pope Leo mentions oh, I'm drawing a blank on her name. She's one of our saints. She's the patroness of migrants. Um, Italian in New York, Cabrini, Mother Cabrini, and I don't know how much you know about her story, uh, but I read somewhere that she crossed the ocean, and of course in those days it was by ship. She crossed the ocean like over 30 times, going back to get more money, more resources coming back. Um, she was a formidable person, and and of course had the courage to speak to power, uh, and establish schools and hospitals and stuff like that, and actually get money out of powerful people. Uh, and from what I've read, it wasn't just because she pandered to them and treated them nicely and asked. She challenged them to give her help, and and kind of forced the situation. And sometimes it takes that. Colleen.
So, Father Frank, lots of times when I'm listening to the readings of the gospel, I think it would be the perfect time to talk about immigration. Yet I very rarely hear it from a homily.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any insight on that?
Well, I do and I don't. um, what one thing I would say is we probably should be speaking more courageously about that. Our bishops have spoken rather courageously about that, and our popes have. And I guess it's kind of cowardice. Um, you know, um, when I get together with other priests, we often talk about this, not just immigration, but all the justice issues. And uh, you know, we bemoan the fact that our people are so polarized that you're going to lose if you get very strong about any of these topics. You're going to lose one half or the other. If you get too much pro immigration, then all those people who have bought into the conspiracy theories about Haitians eating pets and that they're all criminals and you know, crazy as all that is, I have parishioners who believe that whole storyline. They think they're all criminals and they need to be sent home. And they don't really care how mean ICE has to get about it. We've got to get rid of these people. Well, I don't know how to change because the story that they're getting that 24 hours a day from places like Fox News uh, and Newsmax, and you know, there's a ton of them. Um, and you know, I've said for years, one of the worst things to ever happen to this country is 24-hour news, because in order to keep an audience 24 hours a day, first of all, you have to just keep repeating the same stories over and over again. And then you have to ramp up the anger because that gets ratings. And so uh, and it's not even news, it's all commentary. And the left has their stations too, and they do basically the same thing. It's this polarization of angry commentators ramping up people's fears, their anxieties, And so I have parishioners who are victims of that. And they're not going to believe me because they're going to hear it from me once or twice, and they hear it 24/7 from these sources. And you know how the algorithms work, you know, social media, you tap into one storyline and then you get fed more, and it just keeps going and going until you're just locked into an attitude, a way of looking at reality that you don't know any way out of. And you know, I've always subscribed to the theory that we should be reading the whole editorial page in the newspaper, not just the articles that we agree with. And so I try to do that, but you know, it's hard work. and and so I'm not as good at it. I wish I could say that I do that, but I tend to read the articles that that I think I'm going to agree with. So, given that fact, Colleen, how do you preach? And I have a good friend, Father Kerry Niemeyer. You know him, Colleen. He's famous for being so slick about it. You know, he says things, and then after Mass, somebody will walk up to him and say, boy, you really hit him between the eyes and they didn't even know it. You know, I wish I was good at that. And I think I'm guilty of avoidance. I just don't go there. And so it's that's kind of a non-answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. Yes, Joan.
I think what you do is that you bring us the message from the Bible. And the way people hear it is up to the Holy Spirit.
Okay. That's a pretty good way to look at it.
I have a thought that has been going through my mind lately. My grandfather also is from an Irish immigrant family. And when he dropped out of school when he was in third grade, and he drove the mail wagon, horse-drawn mail wagon, from one town to another in New Mexico. And it was probably about 8 miles or so, but he drove that horse-drawn mail wagon by himself as a third grader. And when he got to that town that night, he would stay at the rectory of the local parish, and then they'd load up the wagon and he'd take it back the next day. And I thought, I have this great immigrant story that I never learned enough about. And Sister Rosemary, really, her story really made me think about that. Is that, most of my employees are non-white, and they have a very recent immigrant story. They don't think I have an immigrant story. So I think that if those of us who have an older immigrant story would know that and share that more, we would have a greater connection to our recent immigrants. So that's a thought that I've been pondering recently.
I love that. That's so true. And over the years, I've heard stories, not just from my own family, but from others. I remember the Volga Germans who came into central Kansas. Ellis County would be a kind of a central place for them. And I was leading a tour of the church at Pfeiffer, which is just south of Victoria, and so there was a local woman there who was kind of our tour guide for that event, and she got to telling the old stories, and we were just absolutely mesmerized. And one of the things I remember, and this is probably 30 years ago, that she was telling us this, but I still remember they were promised uh, animals like horses and tools if they would come and farm this land. And when they got there, there were neither horses nor tools. And so they dug dugouts and survived the first winter. They dug them by hand because they didn't even have a spade or a trowel to dig with. Uh, and and they were lied to. You know, they were completely taken advantage of, told this story about how great it was going to be there because it was advantageous to the land dealers to, well, you know, these are age-old stories, aren't they? The Union Pacific Railroad went right through central Kansas, and and the government wanted this transcontinental railroad, and so they gave to these railroad companies like 5 miles on either side of those tracks, and they could sell it to make money, to build the railroad, or they could do whatever they wanted with it. And so they hired these agents who told these stories and lured people from the Ukraine, lured people from the Volga River Valley in Russia, uh, all different kinds of. They told these stories to the French who, and to the Bohemians in Wilson, you know, and and uh, and the railroads got rich off of that. And you know, in the long run, we're here because of that, and that's a good thing. But there was a great deal of suffering and injustice done along the way. So, Debbie, I think it's important that we keep those stories alive.
I wish I had asked more questions. You know, I wish I had asked for the story because my grandfather is long gone.
Yeah.
My mother has been gone for a number of years. But I wish I had asked those questions because I didn't realize how important it would be to know that in today's world.
Right. I mean, how could you have known that? But that's something that's quite universal. Uh, our parents and grandparents died before we know the questions to ask. And there are so many things I wish I would have asked, but I didn't. Sister Rosemary?
Debbie, just to reinforce what you're saying, I had taken a scripture study class several years ago, and because I didn't ask the questions just like you're saying, I didn't get to the root of how grandpa or my grandmother's dad survived over here and what he did. But this professor told us that it's okay to embellish the truth. So what I'm thinking, just to get the interest of what I'm trying to say, I'm going to embellish it a little bit. And they said, that's not wrong. That's not a lie. But that's what the parables do. Some parables really excite me. Other parables don't do much for me. So I don't know if that's of help to you, Debbie, but I think I might try that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I do think that, um, you know, our memory of the story grows greater in our heart. And, you know, as we tell that, it's because it's become greater in our heart. And I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not only not wrong, it's scriptural to embellish.
Oh, okay. See, that's
Because the scriptural passages that survived these thousands of years are the ones that were embellished. You know,
yeah.
they crossed the Red Sea with the water like a wall to their left and to their right. You know, that didn't happen. But the story is great, and it has rich meaning. And so who cares whether it really happened that way or not? The embellishment makes it what it is. Yeah. Okay, we have gone a long time without a break. Let's take about 10 minutes and uh, let's say we'll return at 7:30. Okay, let's come back together again. I see Kinsley has her hand up, but I think Sister Francine, you had your hand up before the break too. Would you like to talk?
I did, Frank. This is maybe off on a little off the immigration thing, but you were talking about polarization, and I think what our parishes and our whatever is missing is, I think if more people had experience in a developing country, they would understand the plight of immigrants. I think experience teaches us many things that words do not. And, if we were like the Mormon church and all teens or whoever had to go out for a year of missionary work or whatever, I think some of the attitudes about immigrants might change. Or
Yeah.
if parishes sponsored mission groups.
Yeah. Well, yes, there's some of that going on, but it would be helpful if a lot more were going on. But also allowing ourselves to have personal contact with immigrants.
Mhm.
I think of a story back in the 80s, I want to say. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Concordia declared their convent a sanctuary for Salvadorans. Do you remember that controversy, sister? And of course it was illegal. And I remember that our bishop, Kucera at the time, was quite upset with them. But they weren't a diocesan order, and he couldn't stop them, so he just had to put up with it. But I heard later that he was rather angry with them. But anyway, so they housed in the mother house, I don't know, over a 10-year period, 20 or 30 Salvadorans. Um, and some of those people, went back home, but others stayed. But I remember there was a woman who was just an ordinary parishioner in Concordia. And she said, when I see these stories on the news about Central America, uh, you know, they're just names and bodies. It doesn't have that much meaning for me. But when a woman who has escaped from El Salvador and is living here in Concordia now, and she's sitting in the pew next to me, that makes it personal. And my attitude has changed. So I think just close contact, uh, even though we wouldn't go there to their country, close contact so that we can actually hear their personal stories would do a lot of the same thing. And
Right now, oh,
go ahead.
I was going to say right now, I'm in Concordia right now, and they were telling me today because they took care of a Ukrainian mother, grandmother, and child. And the child is now 6 years old and was born here. No, was not born here, but they got what do you call it, amnesty or whatever under Biden to come.
Yeah. Yeah.
So today, they had to drive to Houston, Texas to renew his passport.
Wow.
And I think things like that are so cruel. And then I hear that in August that amnesty or whatever you call it is going to be taken away, and they're no longer, quote, legal to be here.
Yes.
So
Right.
I think
Sister,
it's
I
those
think you're referring to asylum.
asylum. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Anyway, I just think it's cruel how we treat people who have no crimes and can't live freely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Thank
totally, yeah. Um, I want to go back to this notion. I noticed Kinsley took their hand down. Did you still want to say something or?
And go ahead.
Okay. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought,
That's
but
okay.
when Colleen asked her question about why priests don't speak up more during homilies, about immigration. And today I just read an article, I think it was a short little 1 page about Bishop Oscar Romero. I think today is his official, he's a saint now, and this is his official day on the calendar. I think he was murdered this day. And when I read through the article, he did the preferential treatment of the poor. I think he was from El Salvador, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Okay. And he spoke out so much against the government and against landowners, trying to help the poor, trying to find justice for them. And then he was murdered during mass. The government, I think soldiers came in and shot him when he was saying mass. And then I don't know if it was started with Pope Francis, but he wanted to canonize him. And then the article said that there were many cardinals and bishops who spoke out against that because they said he was too political. And so he was preaching politics at church instead of preaching, the word of God. And Pope Francis just more or less told him that he was preaching for justice. So I was impressed by the article and the fact that this Colleen asked that question. Because I have often thought that same question that Colleen asked. So
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that's what power normally says is get back in the pulpit where you belong, and just preach the gospel. And what Pope Leo is saying is, hello, this is the gospel. Come on. But I really don't think I'm afraid of having soldiers come in and murder me when I'm saying mass. If it were only that simple, you know. But it's yeah, when I was young, in my first years of priesthood, I was much more outspoken about these issues. And I got labeled. So people who disagreed with me, they were respectful and everything. Well, not always, but they would just write me off like, well, of course he says that. He always talks like that. So you're really not convincing anybody. And it's a I don't mean to sound totally pessimistic here, but it's like the editorial page. Are any of those writers convincing anybody from the other side? Because the only people normally reading them already agree with them. And when you if somebody from the other side does read that, they go, oh, that's nonsense, and I don't want to argue against editorial pages. I mean, I think they're really important. But there is a problem there, and it's a problem with preaching too. We have a priest in our diocese who has preached courageously and wonderfully for decades. And whatever parish he was in, the people who didn't want to hear his message, they drove to other parishes to mass. So I still admire his courage, and I admire the truth that he has always spoken, but it doesn't always have the effect that you would wish it would have either. Yeah, it's just a hard thing to figure out. But thanks for saying that. I really appreciate that. I need to hear that. I'm in ongoing discussion with myself and with other priests. Uh, this is a conundrum that is ongoing, and I hope that we all get better at it, but in an effective way, not just to be written off, but to have some effect. Okay, so one of the things that Pope Leo is coming back to over and over again is the community that that wealth and poverty tend to separate us so that we don't even see the poor. And that's kind of true. Just last night I was speaking with someone, and he said when he first moved to town, and he's a K-State professor, and he came from another university to take a job here about 5 years ago. And so when he first came to town, his family was told, now make sure you buy a house in this area because this is the grade school you want your kids in, because it's high quality. And then well, he and his wife ended up sending their kids to the Catholic school in town anyway, so it didn't make any difference. But he's just saying, you know, he was led to that part of town because that's where the best school was. And then he found out later that there were schools in poorer areas of town that actually had better test scores than that one. And he realized this was nothing but racism. It had nothing to do with the quality of education. It was that you won't, if you live in this neighborhood, you'll never have to worry about anybody brown sitting next to your kid in class. That's really what the issue was. Okay. But because we, you know, do tend to, and it's not necessarily anybody's fault. Sometimes it is. You know, real estate agents have redlined for decades that, you know, that exists and everything like that. But mostly in our small towns in Kansas, it's not real estate agents who are, you know, at fault here or anything. It just happens, you know. And so I lived for 30 some years in Salina, and there were people of color, there were people of other social classes than the parish I lived in. Um, and I just I didn't have any occasion to meet them. There were no social events where they came to that I was at, and vice versa. And so I used to think, well, maybe I ought to just drive there and introduce myself, and you know, that's just so not me. I just couldn't do that. I know people who can, and I admire that, but so we are living separately. And even when we know that we shouldn't be living separately, even though we wish we were living together, we're not. And so it actually takes quite an effort to meet the other side. And one of the things that has happened to me in recent years is here in Manhattan, we have there's a free meal every night of the week put on. For years it was put on by the various churches, and now it's been taken over by the city, but the churches contribute financially to it. And we used to provide the food and everything else. Now the food is provided by the city, but the churches still come and serve it. And so occasionally I help out serving those meals. And you know, it's a real encounter. It's months in between the times I do that. And so therefore I'm always a little bit put back, you know. by the way certain people behave, and their attitudes and things like that. And I think of myself as an enlightened person who should be understanding, but I'm an introvert, and I don't know how to react in those situations, and so it's just interesting, and I'm glad I have that opportunity to have at least some encounter with them. Okay, so I I think Leo is following in the line of his predecessors, particularly Pope Francis, in this notion of community. You remember that Pope Francis' most famous encyclical was Laudato Si, about the environment, about climate change and all that sort of thing. And of course, that was very controversial. And, people love to hate that. And it was vilified by all kinds of people, but celebrated by many too, you know. But what I remember out of that encyclical, well, first of all, the first 20 pages of it was kind of scientific. He was quoting scientific research and that sort of thing. And that was very enlightening to me. First of all, that he really did his research, and quoted experts and everything like that about climate change and the effects that it's having on the earth and things like that. But when it really got interesting to me was when he turned theological and ecclesial. And one of his overarching points was that I'm not just concerned about the earth, I'm concerned about the poor. Because in this climate change, the biggest losers are the poor. They get it in the teeth every time. And that really touched me. Because, I think we should be concerned about the earth. And God created everything, and we should love everything. And God did. Everything God created, he stepped back and pronounced it good and loved it. And we should have that same attitude. I mean, that all makes sense. But I just love the fact that he boiled it down to one of the real issues here is the poor. The poor are devastated by this climate change. And what's happening to the earth is affecting them more than anybody else, because other people they have the money and the means and the political clout or whatever, the systems to sort of deny it, and say, oh, it's future problems. It's not, it's the Marie Antoinette, after us the deluge kind of idea. But the poor don't have that option. It hits them in the face, and there's nothing they can do. They can't get away from it. And so this notion of our all being one community, of our all being connected, of our all being children of God. And the older I get, the more harmful it seems to me, the division among the religions. The religions, from the Latin religio, the word ligament comes from that. So it's religio, reattaching the ligament that has been severed. Religion is supposed to bring together. That's one of the functions of religion. And yet, world religions all through human history have divided more than they've united. We're divided by our doctrines. We're divided by our cultural biases, our ideologies, and I think I grew up that way. I grew up with that attitude that that came from the Baltimore Catechism, I suppose, that the Catholic Church is the one true church, And the worst sin you could ever commit is to leave the Catholic Church. And so even in my priesthood for the first 10 or 20 years, I was just, when a Catholic would become a Lutheran, let's say, I would just feel sort of sad about that, like, oh, how tragic that is. And I've gotten to the point where I think, well, if they're finding God there where they weren't finding God before, God's active there. That's grace. And I'm not bothered by that, but I confess that I was at one time. And I think Leo, he's the leader of the Catholic Church, but I don't experience him as being so closed in on that alone. And I think popes in modern times, they're kind of statesmen too, and they're peacemakers, and like Leo he keeps speaking out, arguing for diplomacy in the Middle East instead of war, and he's dealing not just with the Christians there, but the Muslims and the Jews. And I think he's genuinely as concerned about them as he is the Christians. And the Christians, of course, they're the poor in the Middle East. They get it in the teeth every time. They don't have the clout, they don't have the means to defend themselves, and so they just get less and less. In what was then called Palestine in 1947, at the time of the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel, that region was basically a third, and a third. It was a third Christian, a third Jewish, and a third Muslim. And they were all basically living in peace with each other. And in the 80 some years since that state was established, the Christian presence in Israel, for example, has gone from 33% down to less than 2%. And of course, the Israelis, the ones they really want to get rid of are the Muslims, but they're not getting anywhere with the Muslims. The Muslims aren't going anywhere. They have enough power to fight back. The Christians, they just leave. They get tired of the fight. They get tired of the oppression, and they just leave the country. So they become immigrants to America and Europe and other countries. Okay. Pope Leo points out something that I don't think I ever knew or paid attention to. And I'm looking at slide 28 if you're want to circle that or something. In calling the council, John the 23rd said, "The church presents herself as she is and as she wishes to be, the church of all, and in particular, the church of the poor." And Cardinal Lucero, one of the principal cardinals at the council, said, "This is not simply one theme among others, but in some sense, the only theme of the council as a whole." I don't think I ever heard that before. And maybe we're all myopic in our own way. I'm a liturgist, and so the big issue to me of the council was the reform of the liturgy. And I mean, I've lived most of my priestly life passionate about that, and I just never really thought about it being a council for the poor. And of course, one of my other degrees and background is fundamental theology, which the big document from Vatican II is the document on Revelation. And I have studied that backwards and forwards and up and down. And I love that document. But I never thought about it being for the poor. So I'm going to have to give that some more thought, what exactly that means. Lucero said, "This is the hour of the mystery of the church as mother of the poor. This is the hour of the mystery of Christ, present especially in the poor." And that gets back to that revelation again, that one of the primary revelations of God in the world are the poor. And so that makes me want to go back and look at the document on Revelation again, because one of the principal things that document is about is the ultimate revelation in Christ. But Christ he's the face of the poor. In encountering Christ, we do encounter the poor, because he took on the poverty, born in a stable of uneducated, classless parents, an itinerant preacher with nowhere to lay his head, on and on and on. The Jesus of the Gospels is not a powerful or influential man. He's an outsider. He relates to the poor, and he is the poor. And so this whole notion of revelation, I personally am going to have to go back and think about that more in specific terms of the poor. And then he talks about that preferential option for the poor and what recent popes have said about that. And I think we've already talked about that some, that the reason God takes the side of the poor, and it doesn't mean that he hates the rich. The rich will always get defensive and say, well, what about us? And I think Pope Leo and I think particularly Pope Francis would have said, yeah, what about you? You're taking care of yourself. You don't need anything. One of the reasons you don't know Christ is because you don't have any needs. You're taking care of yourself. One of the groups of people that Jesus challenges in the Gospels are the powerful. And you're self-saving. You don't need God because you're figuring it out yourself. And one of the reasons that our first world countries today are so godless is because we're managing very well on our own, thank you very much, and we don't need God. And the poor do. And so when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," he wasn't naive about that. There are nasty, evil, poor people. It happens to them too. But what Jesus was saying is, if we don't learn how to discover our own poverty, whatever that is, we'll never discover God. We have to find what's lacking in ourselves that relates to what's lacking in the poor. And I identify with them. And until we can do that, it's more and more difficult for us to be saved. And with regard to that, another thing I've been thinking about lately, mostly because of Lent and Easter, this Paschal season, which is, really 90 days, 40 days of Lent and 50 days of Easter. And it's all the Paschal mystery, the dying and the rising. But I think one of the things that's been most difficult for Catholics, and certainly for me, I found over the years that Catholics we're good about celebrating anticipation, but we're not good at celebrating the event itself. So, for example, the anticipation of Christmas starts at Halloween or earlier. You know, people start decorating and shopping and getting ready and ready and ready. And then the day after Christmas, they take the tree down, take the lights down, life as usual. And we know that the Christmas season lasts for several weeks. And there's the Feast of the Holy Family, and there's Epiphany, and that there's something rich and lasting about that season. But our culture and even our Catholics often really don't know how to do that. And the poor, they know how to celebrate at length feasts. So, for example, in Ellis County, the Volga Germans, they had these marriage celebrations called Hogsites, and it would last for a week, and there would be various different elements to it, but basically people would be partying for a week, and they haven't done that for a long, long time because we're too busy making money. I mean, that's wasteful, you know. And when you're poor and you don't have anything, what do you have to lose? So let's live. And well, Easter is that same way. You know, Catholics and Christians in general, you know, we're pretty good at celebrating Lent and, you know, doing extra things and trying to pray more and some fasting and penance and that sort of thing. And then when Easter comes, it's like, you know, it's over. We have a big feast on Easter Day, and then on Easter Monday, we're back at work and everything. Life is like normal. And but the church celebrates Easter for 50 days. And we don't really know how to do that. But the poor do. And so again, it's about discovering our own poverty. That doesn't necessarily have to be in financial terms. But there's a poverty nonetheless. So I've been told that our session is over.
I'm so sorry. I don't want it to be over. It's so great.
Yeah.
But I know other people have commitments. So they always say the greatest is to leave everybody wanting more.
Okay.
So I think we're all wanting more. Do you have anything final you'd like to say, Father Frank?
Just that that handout you have is basically a summary of the document. And so that's yours. And you know, anytime you want to peruse that and kind of refresh your mind about what Pope Leo is saying in this, I hope that'll be helpful to you. And I appreciate all of you coming tonight and participating in this. I just think this is such an important thing. And I appreciate the discussions we've had too.
Thank you. Thank you, Father. Very good. We appreciate this.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Father Frank. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I really appreciate it, and I love seeing you and hearing your stories. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.